Okay, so hi, we're about to start the class, and this is about all you're getting. You're going to hear me talking. So what you need is just a little bit of white, not a whole bunch. So we'll get one started on this side. And then where's the other white? And the other thing that's also come up a lot is I do actually paint many of my minis with craft paint, and people wanted to see how it was done. And the trick that's going to be happening with this is you always hear the joke, thin your paints, right? Whenever you're painting, thin your paints. So what you can do, because this is distilled water, and it's important that it is distilled, if you're using tap water, if you're using even water from bottled water, you're running into the risk of dealing with minerals in your water. And the minerals in your water will affect your paints. So what we're first going to do is we're starting off with a black base, which is basically because this is what's going to speed things up. So if you're looking at your base, you can see that everything is in there, nooks and crannies. When you go to prime something, you want to make sure you're not priming it to the point where it is so overloaded that you're filling in all the details, all right? Oh yeah, we're gonna get the echo effect. No, it's really fine.
What did you stick that into the cup with?
Oh, it's a lovely little thing called sticky tack.
Okay.
And I like to do that because it makes it easy. Yeah, because I did that ahead of time. So if you want to get your base onto something a little bit more easy to hold like this, I actually recommend pill bottles, especially the childproof caps, because then you can spin it. And you can just move it around and you're not having to manipulate the bottle all the time. But we're not about to bring in a whole bunch of prescription bottles for this.
Well, why not?
Well, let's see. There's some important information in there. I wonder. So what I am going to do is, and I always get teased for this, I'm going to put a little bit of the white paint onto a flat brush, okay? Now, my trick to make sure I have the right amount of paint on my brush is I use the back of my wrist. You have a lot of texture there. You're not painting this pure white, you're highlighting the texture. It's basically the concept of highlights, but you're starting with it first. So for those of you who painted minis before, and you've done your base colors, you've done your washes, then you go back to your highlights, we're kind of reversing it slightly. So you're bringing it up from a dark black up to a white, and then we're going to do thin layers of the colors on top. And this is what accelerates the painting process. So you still get something that has depth and layers to it without having to put in a whole bunch of layers one after the other. So what I want you to do is dip your brush in. Now if you want to, you can use the back of your wrist. That's what I do. I'm weird like that. Or you have paper towels. You can also blot off on your paper towels. So basically what I do is I will go on the back of my wrist and make sure that I can still see the grooves and everything in my wrist. And it's just that top layer that's covered. So once you get that effect going on your mini or your wrist, you can take it onto your mini and do the same thing. And you want to make sure your brush is staying pretty much perpendicular to the surface. You don't want to have it dipping into the textures and everything. So once you get it perpendicular to your base, just start dragging it across. And it's going to start highlighting things. And you're definitely going to make a couple of passes doing this. But it's better to start off lightly and then work your way up. You can go in different directions as long as your brush stays perpendicular to your surface area. So on the column, obviously we can't keep it perpendicular flat on the horizontal. That's going to shift to changing it up to the vertical perpendicular. So you're kind of looking for about probably a 50% coverage here in terms of white to black. And you can see already that the textures are being brought out big time on this. So you almost want this looking kind of like a graphic novel that's done in black and white, so it has sort of a cartoonish effect to it. A little bit more white on the brick area because we're going to be putting a dark red on there, and I want to make sure that red pops as opposed to getting lost. Pass around burnt umber from Apple Barrel as well as pewter gray from Apple Barrel. Once you get all your paints around, we're then going to be moving on to burnt umber is going to go onto your ground area, all of it except for where that red brick or the brick area is. So it's basically around the sides where this texture is and a little bit behind the column.
So not where it's raised.
Not where you have the brickwork. Stay away from the brickwork for the burnt umber, okay?
Right. What about the broken pieces?
The broken pieces, those are going to be getting the pewter gray. All right, and it's the exact same technique that you just used. So you're going to take burnt umber. I'm going to start in with burnt umber first, and I'm going to do the dry brushing over. And what happens is it's still very light, but you start picking up the brown through the white dry brush that you just did. And for the leaves, paint over them. Okay, we're going to go back in and fine tune those leaves towards the end. Don't worry about getting color on those at all. It's actually going to be helpful because leaves are not pure green, which is, oh good, the sun moves, the lighting's better. So once you get the burnt umber just on the ground area, avoiding the brick, we're then going to move on to doing the pewter gray onto the column. And there's actually a little broken bit on the ground as well. You want that to get the pewter gray as well using this dry brushing technique. These bottles tend to just flop out a little bit more than you actually need, which is kind of nice because they're craft paints. You can get them for like 50 cents each.
Right.
Alright, so it's basically the same thing. You're just going back through and you're dry brushing your colors back on again.
Right.
Using that, keeping it as perpendicular as possible.
So you're just on the, you're not going on the brick. Okay.
Not going on the brick. The brick is going to get its next treatment.
Okay, so that,
So for those of you who have gotten everything dry brushed with the burnt umber and the pewter gray, we're going to move on now to using that flamenco red. And again, we're dry brushing the brick area. And the trick here, don't get it on that broken piece. Because trust me, that I did. I got a little too carried away doing something else.
How many of these exact pieces have you painted already?
This one is going to be my fourth one.
Of this base?
Of this particular base. Crippled God is the mini group that provided this. They're actually stationed out in Greece. Wonderful team, great guys, and they had sent me a whole bunch of mini bases before. This was one of them. Now you will find with the red, you can go a little bit heavier, but it's okay if some white is peeking through still. Because if you look at natural brick, it's not pure red. You are going to have those tones of whites and creams that naturally get involved with the clay. So yeah, it's basically, if it starts looking like, and actually the English ivy is just a little bit too thick. So you're going to notice that the English ivy is not puddling like the others did. That's where I might go in and either go far more light-handed with the paint, or in that little cup of airbrush thinner, dip your paintbrush in and then dip it into the paint and just sort of draw it out a little bit, and that should help thin it. And once you get the English ivy, what we're going to do is we're going to go around to where that burnt umber was. Alright, so you're covering up the burnt umber with a dry brush. We're going to start making this look more like a grass coverage area. And this you may find you need to do a couple more layers because it is a darker green going over a darker brown. That's too much. And again, just make sure you're avoiding that one little bit of column piece. Okay, now we're going to move on to Granite Gray, and do make sure you thoroughly wash your brush after using the green and the red at this point, because this is a lighter gray. You don't want this gray to have pink undertones or green undertones to it. So once you have your Granite Gray, we're now going to go and address the column. So let's dry brush that column and that little bit, here, you can borrow some of mine because I don't need that much. Just that little bit of stone that is on the ground. And it's just a very, very light dry brush, but you're going to see it's going to highlight the details more. And you don't need to try and get into those deep corkscrew grooves of the column because you want that to have a recessed look to it. Oh yeah, definitely, because I consider that part of the column. Yeah, the base too.
oh,
The triangle,
piece?
yeah, you want to get on that triangular piece as well.
Ooh,
Moving
I
on
forgot that
to
hats, but yeah.
Nutmeg Brown, and this is going to be our last little bit of color right there, before we're going to move on to doing our black wash. And what you're going to do is just very lightly take this Nutmeg Brown and go across the top portion of the red, and this is going to help mute it down a little bit so it's not that bright, obnoxious red. Now, if you have any white that's still exposed, that's perfectly okay because we're going to move on to a black wash, That's going to help fill in any cracks that may have taken on more white than you intended. But nutmeg brown by nature, especially from this particular company, it's a nice thinner brown, which is where when I want to have something to have more of a brown undertone to it, I will go over with that instead of, say, the burnt umber or classic brown or chocolate brown. This is how it's looking so far for this particular base. Yep, but they do a really good job of it, and that's why I think a lot of people use them. So at this point, you want to make sure that your mini dries a little bit, all right? Because we're going to move on to doing a black wash. And in this case, we are going to be using Army Painter because they were kind enough to donate these to us. So Army Painter has set us their classic black wash. I'm just shaking it up right now, as you can hear. And what we're going to do is we're going to coat your entire mini with this black wash. Rules with black washes, you always go from the top to the bottom. Because if you start painting on the bottom and working your way up to the top, by nature it's pulled down by gravity. You don't want it pulling even more so on the bottom of your base. So we're going to start with the top of the column, bring it down the column, then bring it across the brickwork and the ground itself. But we're going to just give this a minute or two to dry, because what's going to happen if you put on a black wash too early, especially with craft paint, that's where the color can get muddied. So alright, I think we should be good. So what we're going to do is just take, literally let's do about 6 drops of the black wash, that's the word I want. And then what you are going to want to do is go to your paint thinner and just put a couple paintbrushes worth of drops. It's not exactly exact science, but put a little bit of that paint thinner in there as well. So what I'll do is just go in with a couple brush worth of the thinner. This you want it to be runny like skim milk as a visual reference. And then once you have a nice runny consistency, we're going to start up at the top of the column, and you're just going to work this wash onto it. And in this case, unlike what we have done before, you are actually going to try and get into those cracks and crevices, because you want this to fall into the recesses of your texture, both on the column and on the base. Now, if you've ever gone in and you started to use a wash and you realize the color is far too intense, you can salvage it by quickly taking toilet paper, I find is best. A lot of times what happens is paper towels have textures to them. So if you try and blot it off with a paper towel, guess what the paint's just taken on? Pattern. So it helps to have a little bit of toilet paper nearby when you're doing it. And what I kind of do is I dab it up and down. I don't go back and forth. And again, that keeps the paint from smearing and getting marred in the process. But this literally is going to go everywhere onto your mini in one wash. But in this case, the black wash is all we needed. And you're going to notice that for those of you who may have had a little white in those recesses of the brick, you can go in with this and tap it on, and it's going to fill those up so it has a dark color to it. And again, this is something where you want it to dry a little bit.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, totally fine. Okay, so for those watching, this is what the base looks like at this point.
Wash.
Perfect. Now what we're going to do is we're going to move on to a color called palm leaf. Okay? Now before you start using this color, just make sure that your ground area is dry.
This is the leaf for the leaves.
This is going to go around the ground. Okay?
Need a little thinner.
Yeah. And this is also, as was just mentioned, you notice it's kind of sticking together like ketchup. Let's thin it out a little bit because you want that maple syrup type thing. So you are going to want to go back in and use your paint thinner and put in a couple drops and thin that out so that the paint behaves a little bit more liquidy. Because if it's too thick, it's just going to glop on and not spread nicely like you need it to. And again, for the people watching, yeah. So you want it to have like a translucent almost look to it in this case. Your mini is dry, and you should just be able to take your fingertip and tap it, and if there's no black coming up on your fingers or any other colors, it is okay to take the color. If it's not doing that yet, don't paint it until you can touch without the paint pulling up. So you're going to take the palm leaf, you're going to go through, and you're going to dry brush over the ground area where we had previously put in the English ivy. And that's going to start heightening up the high points. And again, it's dry brush, perpendicular level, pulling it around. And the point of this is to really bring out the higher points to the ground. Right on the money, as I had hoped. Now, Now that palm leaf is out, what you can then do once you've done the dry brush around the ground itself, go back into the palm leaf and you are then going to paint your leaves with the palm leaf using the fine tip brush, okay? And you can paint these out in full, but what helps is to, again, just to kind of work on the surface. If you're gonna try and get around the edges of the leaves, you're gonna make yourself crazy. So you wanna highlight the flat surface of your leaves to bring those out.
Are these the leaves that are on the base of the...
Yep, there are leaves on the base. Yep, there are leaves on the base of the column.
Okay.
So those raised little bits are leaves. There's also some leaves
On the brick there?
on the brick.
Wow.
Yep.
And we're doing the darker green with that, or
The palm leaf.
with the someone you say there?
The palm leaf is what
But
we're
that's
going to
the
use.
other brush. Okay.
Yeah, that's the fine tip brush. That's where that one comes into play.
We're gonna use it.
And really what you want to do is just get the top color of, or the top of the leaf painted with that color. Don't make yourself nuts and try and get around the edges, because you're going to start painting brick, you're going to start painting column, as opposed to just the leaf itself. A little bit so everyone can see. Okay. Of the creams and the whites. What we're going to do is we're going to go back to the bricks and we're going to do a very light-handed highlighting using maybe light mocha, which also has come out thick, so I'm going to advise that you make sure to thin that out. And with the light mocha, it's in its name. Go very lightly over the brick with this. You don't want full coverage. You're basically going to start highlighting the harder edges to bring out the detail of the brick. And it is going to be very, very, very light-handed. The less paint you have on your brush, the better in this situation, so you don't overdo it. Work with is the antique white, and that's basically going to go onto our columns, or our column, as well as that little piece of broken column on the bottom part of the base, right near the brickwork. And once you highlight those guys, you can actually go back to your leaves and use that to very lightly highlight your leaves, okay? Because this is such a vibrant green, this is going to draw out the edge details of your leaves. But again, you want to make sure there's like barely any of this paint color on your brush when you go to do that. But for the column itself, you can just do another dry brush on it, and it's going to start giving it that last round of highlight.
Okay, I think this is where we want it on the brick.
Yeah, perfect. That's great. Very nice. Sometimes what I will do, especially with the more craft-based paints, I will actually do thinned out Mod Podge as a means to seal it. It protects the paint, it gets the paint to sort of harden up a little bit more. So really it's one of those things where if you would like to seal it while you're here to protect it, you can definitely do that. I'll just get some Mod Podge going and get it thinned out a little bit. So if you want to seal it, you just need to make sure that this is totally dry, as usual, and then you can do a nice little light coat of Mod Podge on top of your base. However, if you are staying for the Dwarf Mini, don't do it, because we want that paint to be non-Mod Podged or non-sealed to make sure that the glues adhere nicely, as opposed to a top layer. We want to get it a little bit more of a better adhesion. All right, so for those of you who've been watching on this, basically what's going to happen, you can seal it however you want to, however you're going to put a Mini onto it. Make sure you wait, get the Mini put on first, and then you can seal your Mini and your base together. That is going to be it for this live stream. Join me at 3:30 for the Dwarf Mini painting class, which will be happening within the hour. So take care, everyone, online. See you in a bit.